Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're coming to you from Alliance Magazine in London and being joined by our expert speakers, friends, and colleagues all around the philanthropy world. I'm Charles Keedon, the executive editor of Alliance Magazine and the moderator of today's webinar. This event is part of Alliance's special 25th anniversary series, exploring what the future of philanthropy holds in 6 different regions across the world, including the Arab region, Africa, Europe, Asia and the Pacific, and Latin America. This webinar, in partnership with the United Philanthropy Forum, focuses on future directions for philanthropy in the US and Canada. Is the field facing an existential crisis or moment of opportunity? Over the last 18 months, the US has reckoned with a pandemic, a breakdown of race relations, rising wealth inequality, the looming threat of climate change, and a disorderly transition of power. US philanthropy has responded with more funding, more flexibility, and greater urgency in promoting racial justice, action on climate change, and reforms to its own practice. But is it enough? And is the outlook different in Canada? We at Alliance have privilege and power in putting together these events, and I want to acknowledge our responsibility to ensure the framing, language, and choices we exercise are the right ones. But any failings are ours alone. And being mindful of that, I'm both delighted and grateful to be joined by an impressive group of panelists today, including Marissa Tirona, President of Grantmakers Concerned with Immigrants and Refugees, Dr. Maribel Moray, Director of the Miami Institute for Social Sciences and co-founder of the Hisfill website, and also Hilary Pearson, founder and former president of Philanthropic Foundations Canada. I'm also delighted to have Amanda Ander, the chair of United Philanthropy Forum, with us today. She'll say a few words of welcome in a moment and provide some reflections at the close of today's discussion. Just a few things before I hand the floor to Amanda. First of all, in the chat, as some of you, like Jem Bokhoff and others are discovering, go say hello to one another in our chat on the right-hand side of your screen and post your questions, and I'll put as many of them to the panel during the discussion. You can also join the conversation on Twitter at Alliance Mag and using the hashtag #PhilanthropyUSCanada. Please do remember, if you're not already, to subscribe or consider subscribing. Everyone joining the webinar today is entitled to a 20% discount on subscriptions, which will include our special 100th issue being released in September. To get that 20% discount, use the offers button on the right-hand side of the screen, and you should be able to claim a subscription there. But first off, I'd just like to thank our partners at the United Philanthropy Forum for their involvement in today's event. And I'm delighted to hand over to Amanda, UPF's chair, for some opening comments. Welcome, Amanda. And just make sure your microphone's on. Sorry, Amanda, we can't hear you. Will you try just turning your microphone on and off again, please? Amanda's just having a few technical problems, but she's going to rejoin the room in a moment, so we're just going to hold on. And hopefully she'll be back in a moment.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Beautiful.
Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you so much for having me. And
welcome. Here you are. We can see you too.
Okay. Well, I am Amanda Indire, she, her pronouns. I am greeting you from Reston, Virginia, right outside of DC on the ancestral land of the Montauk tribe. I'm the CEO of Funders Together to End Homelessness. We are a national network based in the United States, although we do have members in Canada as well, of philanthropy committed to housing and racial justice. Today, I greet you in my role as the board chair of the United Philanthropy Forum, and I want to thank the incredible staff at the forum for partnering with the Alliance on this. First network in American philanthropy, the United Philanthropy Forum holds a unique position in the social sector to help increase philanthropy's impact in communities across the country. We are a membership network of more than 90 regional and national philanthropy serving organizations, PSOs, representing more than 7,000 funders who work to make philanthropy better. The forum envisions a courageous philanthropy sector that catalyzes a just and equitable society where all can participate and prosper. Our conversation today will tackle the very issues we have been grappling with as a network. When is philanthropy most courageous? When will we get out of the way and center people with lived experience, trust historically marginalized and historically excluded and minoritized folks with the resources that were mostly gained from stolen indigenous land, chattel slavery, and racial capitalism? Is diversity and inclusion enough? Or do we need to take bold action that starts to dismantle power and decolonize the role of philanthropy as gatekeepers by leading with justice and liberation? I know for me as the board chair, for many of our members, we want to be a network that doesn't just serve philanthropy, but leads with vision and action. And that action has to start with change at the policy and systems level. I look forward to the conversation today that starts to get us there. And I just remind us to think about how we center ourselves in this work, how we are all gatekeepers by the privilege that we might have, and that we start to decolonize our own thinking as we think about philanthropy and its role. So I look forward to the conversation today, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Amanda, for that introduction and for those timely reminders. Amanda will be back towards the end with some reflections on what we've been hearing during the discussion and your comments. But for now, I'd like to turn to our opening panelist, Marissa Tirona, who will just speak for up to 5 minutes, just with some comments on what she sees as the priorities for philanthropy in the US and whether they're the best ones to serve future generations, and what meaningful changes are needed from funders in the wake of some of the issues we were highlighting that have occurred in the US in the last 18 months. So warm welcome to you, Marissa. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Charles, and thank you so much, Amanda, for the introduction, and really to the entire Alliance team for inviting me to participate on today's panel. As Charles mentioned, my name is Marissa Tirona, and I'm the president of Grantmakers Concerned with Immigrant and Refugees. I am based in Brooklyn, New York. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm also based on Lenape territory. With respect to the question of sort of the current priorities for philanthropy and whether these are the right ones, I'm sort of thinking about this issue to best serve future generations. A couple of initial thoughts. One is I would be hard pressed to identify what the collective priorities would be for institutional philanthropy in the United States because the interests are so divergent and the sector itself hasn't prioritized developing a shared, collective, and cohesive vision for itself. That being said, what I can speak to are the emerging priorities as they both relate to strategy and practice that have emerged in the U.S. institutional philanthropic sector. And I want to be really clear that I'm focusing on the U.S. institutional philanthropic sector when really philanthropy has a very broad term and encompasses both institutional and individual philanthropy at many different levels. So I'll share with you some of those sort of emerging priorities with a caveat that my list is illustrative and not comprehensive. And really where I want to begin is, as we have seen in response to the uprisings of 2020, an increased investment in addressing racial justice with specific significant investment, rightfully so, in organizations led by and for Black people. Commensurate with those increased investments, we've also seen similar investments made by larger philanthropic institutions in power building and in organizing. And interestingly, at least I think it's interesting, a lot of those power building investments that are now coming from larger philanthropic institutions are really situated within the context of promoting democratic processes in the United States, as well as really rebuilding trust in our governmental institutions. And simultaneously, these power building strategies are also helping to address disinformation and unfortunately rising authoritarianism too. And finally, and rightfully so, the focus on climate change has continued to grow within the United States institutional philanthropic sector, with even more emphasis now on centering justice in addressing that existential challenge. In addition to these strategies, though, I also want to note a couple of notable practices that seem to be taking root across the, again, institutional philanthropic sector. One is we're seeing incremental moves, especially by larger institutional philanthropies, to invest more in multi-year and unrestricted support. And we are also seeing more philanthropic leaders and institutions issue calls to action to their peers to reimagine grant making, which I'm particularly excited about. The Climate Justice Funders Pledge and Marguerite Casey's recent initiative, Answering the Uprising, Closing the Say-Do Gap in Philanthropy, are just two examples. And I'd also would want to call our attention to a recent letter that was shared by a collective of authors. It's called An Open Letter to Philanthropy from People of Color-Led, Movement Accountable Public Foundations. It's really instructive on kind of this existential crisis that philanthropy is in right now, especially in response to the uprisings of 2020. I'd like to quote directly from that call to action, and I would encourage all of our audience members to take a closer look at the letter. The uprisings of 2020 sparked historic levels of philanthropic giving to address racial injustice. For philanthropy, this signals a tremendous and unprecedented opportunity to dismantle white supremacy in both our country, who we fund, and our sector, how we fund. In both contexts, the cornerstone of white supremacy is dominance and control. By contrast, the cornerstone of racial equity is sharing resources and decision-making power in a way that fundamentally supports the self-determination of people of color. I really feel that this letter in particular is instructive on this moment of opportunity within the philanthropic sector. And as the letter goes on to share, POC-led movement accountable funders have been actively practicing this type of grant making for years. So when I think about the funders that need to shift in response to this existential crisis or moment of opportunity, I'm talking about larger institutional philanthropy. Fortunately, these funders have a blueprint, really from smaller social justice funders across the United States who have been on the leading edge of reimagining what it means to be a grant maker. I would have to say I've been most energized in particular by the leadership of people of color, philanthropic leaders, in particular women of color leaders like Carmen Rojas at Marguerite Casey Foundation, Jennifer Ching at the North Star Fund, Vanessa Daniel at Groundswell, among many others, because there are a lot of us, whose purposeful and intentional strategies have shifted power in their institutions, built power with their grantees, and really catalyzed sector-wide conversations about racial justice. And I think as a result, there are in fact more philanthropic institutions who are now beginning to implement practices that actually center and support racial justice by investing in power building and movement infrastructure, by funding organizations led by and for Black people, by prioritizing community member leadership and decision making, and by providing multi-year general operating support. I would also say that these changes aren't happening quickly enough among larger institutions. And I believe that one of the main barriers to this transformative work taking root is a struggle or lack of commitment to addressing racial justice internally within larger institutions. I think while more foundations are now beginning to address racial injustice in their grant-making strategies, most struggle with, and some even actively resist, addressing issues of unequal power and privilege within their own institutions. This lack of analysis of internal institutional power, both implicit and explicit, I think prevents some institutions from becoming the anti-racist organizations that our collective liberation needs.
Thank you. Thank you for those introductory words, Marissa. Some very poignant comments in that open letter that you highlight. You mentioned there's an existential crisis, but also you were highlighting some great potential opportunities for change. So I'm struck by your optimism. Just a couple of very brief supplementary comments, if I may. Amanda, in her introduction, talked about the role of infrastructure bodies, not just in following their members, but leading them. Now, you lead an infrastructure body looking at immigrants and refugees, and I just wonder, in your space, how you see these issues developing. Are you seeing more philanthropic engagement with your work and respect for the leadership that you're trying to develop?
I think so, yes. And I'll say this. I'm really heartened by the collective work that organizations like mine, I'm going to use the shorthand Giser because it's too long to say the entire name, and like Amanda's organizations are doing to move both money and power. At my organization, we talk about our role in the U.S. social justice ecosystem as a philanthropic mobilizing organization that shapes strategic opportunities to move money and power. And so we do this by pushing philanthropy to invest in immigrant, indigenous, Black, and brown leaders, to resource advocates and organizers over the long term, and to invest in the sustained emotional health and physical security of the movements, coalitions, and organizations that are on the front lines in doing this work to build enduring social change. So I say that, and I share that because we haven't met a lot of resistance to that catalyzing that we've been doing, and I've been really heartened by the way we've been able to engage a lot of funders, especially local funders in the United States and various regions, and smaller funders as well, who really want to be engaged in the work differently. And I think the way that we are doing that effectively, and this is what I talk about with our team, is as long as our gaze is fixed on the movement, we're going to be more effective in the work we do as a philanthropic mobilizing organization.
Thank you. That's very clear, and I think we're going to hear some of these themes in our next speaker. Thank you, Marissa. Our next speaker is Dr. Maribel Moray from the Miami Institute for Social Sciences, but also the co-founder of the HISPhil blog and website, which has been a terrific resource providing more of a historical perspective on philanthropy, which we particularly welcome. So welcome to you, Maribel, and thank you for joining us. Maribel's going to talk just briefly about some of why criticism of elite philanthropy has grown in recent years and what meaningful changes are needed, and maybe also comment on some of the major shifts in giving that we're seeing today, particularly thinking of the grant making of Mackenzie Scott. So over to you, Maribel.
Thank you for the invitation, Charles. It's a pleasure to be in this group, and I look forward to the conversation. And again, as Charles already mentioned, my name is Maribel Moray, and I am dialing in from Miami. So I will push back in the first question and say that criticisms of elite philanthropy have been longstanding. So it's not something new, though I will explain later how, even though it's not new, how philanthropy can respond today. So from the very start, at the genesis of elite foundations in the US in the 1910s, for example, there has existed criticism. So in the 1910s, Republican Senator Miles Poindexter from Washington argued that the exclusion of Rockefeller and Carnegie influences in education was as important as the separation of church and state. Quote, "The cult of Rockefeller, the cult of Carnegie, in the viewpoint which they represent in political economy and in government, is just as much to be guarded against in the educational system of the country as a particular religious sect," end quote. Beyond the US Congress and to the world of lay observers, I situate W.B. Du Bois in an upcoming piece with the Oxford University Press Handbook on Du Bois as an avant-garde critical scholar of modern US philanthropy, who is very aware of philanthropic practices in the US and British Africa, whose own biography in the field begins during the same decade as these organizations' founding, with his 1918 review of a 1917 survey of Black schools financed by the Phelps-Stokes Fund and authored by Thomas Jesse Jones. Reviewing Jones's 2-volume book, for example, Du Bois retorted, quote, "The Black person who shows the slightest independence of thought or character is apt to be read out of all possible influence, not only by the white South, but by the philanthropic North," end quote. He was well aware that someone such as himself, a well-accomplished Black scholar, would not be a critical advisor to these foundations, while someone such as Thomas Jesse Jones, a white scholar, would be. Du Bois in the 1910s and 1920s, I argue, was a hopeful critic of US philanthropy, though he later became more fully disillusioned by the 1930s, and I can talk about that in the Q&A. Ever since Du Bois's lifetime, the critical study of philanthropy has continued, increasingly with the opening of the Rockefeller Archive Center in the 1970s. For more on that context, I send you to read Barry Carl and Stanley Katz's piece, Foundations and Ruling Class Elites, in 1987. Critical observers span the spectrum, both as Gramscian critics of US philanthropy who see foundations as part of a hegemonic presence in society, to critics who are embracing more incremental reforms. From Inderjeet Parmar, Lindsay McGoey, Tiffany Willoughby-Herrard, Janelle Scott, Ray Madoff, Rob Reich, Anandgiri Haradas, Chiara Cordelli, Tanisha Ford, Megan Ming Francis, Nolwenn Brooks, and many others. Adding to this, today there are social phenomena in the US and globally pushing these critiques to the fore, much as they once had been in the US in the early 20th century. We're seeing peaking wealth inequality in the US and globally, racial inequality, with philanthropy being a reflection of both. To be honest, what we need is real systemic changes, honestly addressing the problem of white Anglo-American supremacy across so many aspects of our lives, from the private sector and nonprofit sector to the governmental sector at the national and global levels. We need to question the purposes and aims of these white Anglo-American-led spaces, government, finance, the academy, and philanthropy, when they govern, fund, and study us, the other, the global majority, in the global North and South. For example, within the world of the academy, philanthropy, and public policymaking, how do dominant scholars, policymakers, and grant makers discuss and define equality with us, the global majority? What alternative forms of knowledge, of funding, of governance, perhaps suppressed, could have led and could lead us towards more equitable, sustainable national and international political economies? While coming together to ask these questions and imagine and plan for more systemic changes in society, and thus a reassessment of the role of elite US philanthropy in a just, sustainable, and more humane world. In the meantime, many of us are also calling for more incremental changes in elite philanthropy in the US. Some of these incremental changes include diversifying foundation boards, increasing foundation payouts, introducing required payouts from DAFs, greater public transparency and accountability from elite foundations and philanthropists. In that context, Mackenzie Scott's giving has been criticized for not being as transparent and accountable to the public as it could be, but it's within a broader context of philanthropists also moving from a 501c3 structure to LLCs that have less transparency. And the movement of funds towards BIPOC-led organizations, specifically Black-led organizations. This is all to say that the critiques of US philanthropy are not new. They have existed as long as elite philanthropy in the US has existed itself. And in the same vein, they will not go away. That said, they indeed have had most public traction in the US during the first Gilded Age of the early 20th century, and now during the second Gilded Age. Today, in the second Gilded Age, elite US philanthropy, at the very least, should and needs to respond to the most incremental of reforms, though hopefully it also will respond to much more structural critiques. Otherwise, elite US philanthropy will continue to prove itself, both in its rejection of greater public transparency, public accountability, and quicker wealth redistribution, to be much more invested in preserving the privacy and financial interests of a few than in actually serving the public.
Thank you very much, Maribel, for that very trenchant critique of philanthropy. The stakes are clearly high for the field in the US. Lots of challenges being raised, questions around whether the changes that are needed for philanthropy, or at least elite philanthropy, should be incremental or more radical. And before I come back to you with just an additional question, it's actually, because of what you said, it's just a great moment for everyone listening here just to go to the poll button, click on the poll button. And some of the reforms that were discussed there are also listed in the poll. It'd be great to get your views of everyone listening here on what reforms are most needed to get US philanthropy back on track. The first option is diversifying foundation boards. The second, increasing foundation payouts. The third, introducing required payouts from donor advised funds. The fourth, making billionaires pay more taxes for a wealth tax, or other. Tell us in the chat. But it'd be great to hear your reactions to that. Just going to give a few moments just to allow people just to select what option they think is most necessary at this time for philanthropy, and then we'll come back just for a bit of reaction from you, Maribel, to what we're hearing, if that's okay. And I should say there's over 200 of you around the world listening live and hopefully voting on this, so hopefully have a decent cross-section of responses. we have a significant majority saying that actually the reform that's most needed is making billionaires pay more tax through a wealth tax. 56% of you saying that. 20% saying diversifying foundation boards. 13% saying increasing foundation payouts. 8% saying introducing payouts for donor advised funds. And there's some people that are probably making some comments known to us in the chat, which we can come back to. That's a very interesting top of the mind reaction. And Maribel, can I just get your reaction to that on that spectrum of more incremental versus more radical changes? Go ahead.
So would I want between these incremental changes, which one I would pick, or between incremental and
just looking at the votes there, a significant majority saying, making billionaires pay more tax. That seems to be more on a structural question of political economy than just a narrow reform of philanthropy.
Yeah, no, I think I choose all of the above. I don't think you have to choose. So maybe that's my problem with multiple choice. But why I say that you need all of the above is for the reasons also that Marissa was mentioning as well, that you need internal structural changes within foundations. So when we're talking about diversifying foundation boards, it's really important. That also means people who would be able to push back against even like the donor's intent or have a different, just a vision of the relationship between philanthropy and government even to push against some of the neoliberal assumptions. So I think that's an important level that making billionaires pay more taxes might not necessarily address, or it might be complementary. So I think they're all complementary and needed reforms.
Thank you, and thank you for that analysis of the poll. Of course, they're not mutually exclusive, but of course we're just seeing the priorities. But I think you're right. It's good to highlight a spotlight, put a spotlight on all of those elements and discuss them. So thank you for that, and thank you, Maribel, for your remarks. I'm now going to move the conversation to Canada as part of our effort to take a more global view in this series, Alliance's 25th anniversary series. I'm really delighted to bring in long-standing colleague Hilary Pearson, who for many years was the director and president of the Philanthropic Foundations of Canada. And Hilary's going to also provide a bit of a longer term perspective on where things are in Canada and whether things just look very different there compared to what we've been hearing in the US. Welcome, Hilary.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Charles. And I think that there are similarities and there are differences, and we can talk about that. I'm speaking to you today from Montreal, which is on the traditional territories of the Kanen'keha Mohawk people. And I think it's good to begin with context, or maybe a little bit of history. I'm a big believer in history. It informs, I hope, our present, what we know and what we don't know. And the first thing to say is that we Canadians live in a small country that sits next to a very large, influential, and noisy one. And so inevitably our trajectory has been influenced by what goes on to the south of us. This is true when it comes to the history of organized philanthropy, absolutely, especially in English-speaking Canada. Cross-border personal and business connections shaped the creation of private charitable trusts in Canada at much the same time as they were created in the United States. In fact, one of our early 20th century prime ministers, Mackenzie King, worked at the Rockefeller Foundation for some years. So presumably was somewhat influenced by elite philanthropy. The Winnipeg Foundation, our first community foundation, was created in 1921 on the model of the Cleveland Foundation, created in 1914. So we have been practicing philanthropy using the same basic models for over a century. But being a smaller country with a population that's stretched pretty thin over a huge territory, it's taken us longer to knit ourselves together. Philanthropic networks in Canada are not even 30 years old. In 2001, I came into the field to run, as you said, Charles, Philanthropic Foundations Canada, and it was brand new at that time. So my role was to help build this new membership organization to connect private and public foundations. And my colleagues in Community Foundations of Canada were not that much older than us. So this might suggest that Canada has age, but not maturity as compared to the United States. Not so. We have caught up quickly in terms of our thinking and practice as a field. And where I believe we excel in comparison to the United States is in our relative success, at collaboration. It's a particular advantage when it comes to tackling complex, wicked problems that require collective action, such as dealing with the climate emergency. In general, Canadians are centrists, pragmatists. Without the extremes of ideological and values polarization that we see in the United States, foundations across the country can work together without having to declare a side. It's true that we are more willing than Americans to cede the lead to government, even allowing for some regional difference on this from west to east. And from the 1960s on, pretty much, we have had a progressive tilt to our federal politics, which has brought us to a place where public education, public health, and social security supports give the majority of our population a safety net that simply isn't there in the United States. And yet, in the last 25 years, we have seen the constraints on government, which are both financial, fiscal, and human. And we don't expect government today to be the source of social innovation. In the last 20 years, I have seen a leap forward in Canadian philanthropy itself around collaboration, collaborative initiatives to generate ideas, to experiment, to pilot test, and finally, to begin to advocate for policy changes that we see as important to our collective future. On the issues of today, of 2021 and beyond, inequality, systemic racism, climate emergency, I think that Canadian philanthropy has much to offer inside and outside our borders. We live in a country which has a lot of expertise in extracting and burning carbon, and we have an enormous environmental space at risk: land, water, air. Together, Canadian philanthropists are working on making space for policy development, generating ideas around carbon pricing, developing marine and forest conservation, driving collaboration in our urban centers to get to net zero. In another dimension, we live in a pluralist society of immigrants. Most of our large urban centers have welcomed and integrated large numbers of immigrants and refugees from East and South Asia, from the Middle East, from Africa, and all this has happened in many cases in the last 25 years. This means that philanthropy has plenty of opportunity to work collaboratively and at scale on social inclusion. And as settlers, we share the land with the many Indigenous peoples who are the original inhabitants. This means an opportunity for philanthropy to step up collectively to the work of relationship building and reconciliation. Are we doing it as well as we could? Nope. Canadian philanthropy has weaknesses. Our pragmatism can become caution. Our modesty can become lack of aspiration. Organized philanthropy itself is not diverse, and that means that there are important voices and perspectives that aren't included. Foundations here, too, can be justifiably critiqued for opaqueness, for elitism. And we can be too polite. That's the famous Canadian politeness, but it shows up in our relative reluctance, historically, to step up in public, to advocate, and to organize for social change. Yet events of the last year and the consequences of the pandemic are changing this, I think, in Canada as in the US. I have seen more foundations come together to speak publicly on the inequalities revealed so clearly by the pandemic. It showed us the gaps in health and childcare coverage, in support for racialized and vulnerable populations, in mental health services. And these gaps are now pushing funders to become bolder, I think, in making collective statements on the need and the urgency for policy change, and in making collective commitments to change the work of philanthropy itself. Many Canadian foundations signed a pledge during the pandemic to free their grants from restrictions, to grant for longer periods, to make themselves more transparent and accessible. And funders are trying to listen better and to figure out how they can be better partners with community leaders. I'm optimistic that we'll pursue this path. I don't think it was just a short-term reaction. Perhaps my job at PFC suggested that I would always be optimistic, but I do believe that we are going to continue down this path. And as a small but connected country, I think that we can and will share more widely some of what really works in Canadian philanthropy for ourselves, and I think to help philanthropic communities beyond our borders. Thanks. I'm glad to talk about this in the Q&A.
Thank you, Hilary. That was really clear, and I can see your kind of passion for Canadian philanthropy, but also willingness to recognise the shortcomings that the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed, and grateful for you bringing in that very important context in terms of whether that might accelerate or trigger certain changes. Before we open up to the wider conversation, there's lots of activity and lots of questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of them. Just want to ask you a specific question about Indigenous population in Canada. Is Canadian philanthropy angry enough about what has been revealed in terms of the historic abuses of Indigenous populations, particularly children in Canada, for which our country in the UK also bears significant responsibility? Is the elitism of Canadian philanthropy that you referred to preventing it from being sufficiently angry to take the steps that are needed? Great if you could just comment on that.
Yeah, no, that's such an important question, Charles. And, yes, I do think that, I can't say that in general all foundations feel the same way, but I certainly think that there's a strong view among some important influential foundations in this country that the work of reconciliation has got to accelerate. I think saying that, though, we're very sensitive to a couple of things. One is that philanthropy does not take the lead here, that it is Indigenous people themselves that we take our cue from, that the work of reconciliation is a reciprocal work. It's about building relation. And I think that we have had some very wise direction on this from Indigenous leaders, people who have said to us, this is multi-generational work. This is not a quick fix. This has to be paid attention to, but it's also going to take a long time, and it should, because the idea here is to build relationship. It is not simply to place a bigger Band-Aid. So yes, I think there's urgency now, but I think we also have to balance that with the need to have patience and to allow, and allow is not the right word, to take the lead from Indigenous people themselves and from their communities and have them tell us, how do they want that relationship to develop?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for that response. And I'm sure we have covered issues at Alliance on Indigenous philanthropy. We devoted an issue to it last year. What we heard from them was not just a focus on reconciliation, but also reparations. Yes. And the question of the relationship between philanthropy and reparations is maybe one that others might want to comment on. But if I can just bring everyone who's been speaking on the panel just in now, just for a wider conversation. I'd just like to pick up on this question of elitism and diversity and ask your views on that. So the Gates Foundation, obviously the world's most important and largest foundation, it now has just 2 trustees following the death of Bill Gates Sr. A year or so ago, and obviously Warren Buffett's resignation. What it does has significance for the reputation and standing of our sector. And I think I'd be remiss in not asking in a conversation about US philanthropy, what you think about a foundation having just 2 board members, both of whom are currently getting divorced, but with no wider board representation. Now, I know that is due, there's announcements due about changes that will happen next year. But as things stand, we've got 2 individuals responsible for spending billions of dollars a year in terms of the fiduciary governance responsibility. I just wonder whether either Maribel or Marissa would just like to comment specifically about elitism, using that example as a reference point for our field. Marissa.
I don't normally quote Twitter. I like to quote poetry instead, but I will quote a tweet that I read that, to summarize or paraphrase, the fact that a failed relationship between 2 people could have such a significant impact on healthcare systems and countries is problematic. And I'm borrowing someone else's words, but to have that much power and control concentrated in the hands of the few is unfortunately very much a symptom of elite institutional philanthropy in the United States. And what I get energized by, I'm a pragmatic optimist, is that I do see more movement work being done by social justice funders and organizers who want to move more towards participatory grant making and ensuring that decision making around resources are stewarded by the collective as opposed to just a few. But I think that you're hitting the nail on the head here in terms of one of the most significant problems of elite institutional philanthropy in the United States.
And if I could, thank you. And if I could just put that to Maribel, do you think the similarities between someone like the philanthropy of Bill Gates or Melinda Gates and the philanthropy of Mackenzie Scott are greater than the differences? I mean, do you think that actually what Mackenzie Scott represents is something that is very different, a different form of philanthropy, or is it just philanthropy with more progressive orientation for all the reasons that have been described in the press in terms of multi-year funding, trusting the partners, greater humility, but ultimately emanates from a similar source? So do you think similarities outweigh the differences?
I think the big difference is that generally the public seems a lot more defensive of Mackenzie Scott's philanthropy than they are of Gates. And I would say too that even in the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors, there's a lot more self-censorship in any critique of Scott's philanthropy than there is of Gates right now. So I think that one is that some organizations feel that if they just stay quiet, maybe, just maybe they'll be the next one to get $4 million from the clouds in that way. So I think, and then two, I think that Bill Gates has come under a lot more scrutiny as a person. So being brought down from the pedestal leaves a lot more room for criticism. So I would say that the big difference I see is the amount of space that the public in the U.S. and and then more specifically the philanthropic and nonprofit sectors allow for critical engagement with either one of their philanthropic practices. Now, as far as what I think of their work, they're both very guarded. They're not so big on explaining how they get to their funding decisions. And I have said it before, I think that they do owe the public that because they are playing a public role. And if you're playing such a public role, for example, Bill Gates, in shaping public education, public health, you're shaping the public realm. And so is Mackenzie Scott. She's also, in her own way, very much shaping behavior already in the nonprofit sector because people really hope to get some of that money, even if they're not directly a grantee. One last point on this is that a commonality is that I do think the US public today feels less empowered to criticize philanthropy generally, or to even feel like they have a right to define public resources or what are public resources, from education to public health. So I think that, we've lost some of that sense that the public has a right to shape the world around them.
Thank you. Hilary, do you want to respond to what you're hearing?
Yeah, I think this question speaks to this question of sort of families and small boards controlling massive amounts of resources and making very big decisions. It kind of speaks to this bigger question of whether family philanthropy at massive scale is an appropriate model to use. We've had relatively few very large foundations in Canada. There are more now that are starting to develop, but generally speaking, we haven't had a debate around this because most family foundations are small and also don't take a public stand, as I mentioned earlier. And I think that there is a relationship here between your role, playing a role that is more of an advocacy role, sort of stepping into this question of change, social change, systemic change, and your accountability as an organization. I do think that this is a weak link for many foundations. The lack of diversity of their boards has been something that we have been talking about, that the network that I formerly ran is actually spending a lot of time on now. We're trying to support more thinking around how to diversify the voices at the table so that even if the family remains the dominant force on the board, that they are listening to people outside of the family, and that listening to them in meaningful ways, not just simply going out and having a brief consultation and never giving any feedback. I think this whole question of how you hear other voices, how you bring them into the decision making, is connected to the role that you want to play in society in a more public sense. So the more public you are, the more concerned you are about making change. And I think the more urgency you feel, the more accountable and diverse your governance should be.
Thank you. Thanks. That's a very clear answer. And I should note, in the UK, there's a promising initiative to rate foundations on their diversity, transparency, and accountability that's indeed funded by some of the more progressive foundations here. So we will look with interest to see where that goes. I want to turn to questions that have come in either in the chat or submitted in advance. Have one for you, Marissa, from Jeffrey Ash from Grassroots Finance Action. He says, our focus is on immigrants and strengthening community mechanisms, saving circles such as Tandas and Susu to finance daily needs and build businesses. And our need is for small amounts of flexible funding to test out new ideas. How can philanthropy provide smaller pools of unrestricted funding to explore and document new approaches? Can put that to you, Marissa, please.
I think that's a great question from, was it Jeffrey or? That's a wonderful question, and I think you actually laid out the pathway for how to do that, which would be to really to stimulate and sort of strengthen the innovation that's already happening. I mean, it's fascinating in response to the pandemic in the U.S. How that catalyzed the sort of growth of mutual aid societies, and that is a form of philanthropy. And when I think about the work that's been done by groups like IOBI, for example, to really support that kind of participatory grant making where innovation, it's flexible, where innovation can happen, flexible funding can happen. I'm really energized by that. And I will say, again, I'm sorry if I keep repeating this point over and over again, but it has been a lot of the smaller social justice funders who've been in the vanguard in terms of supporting that type of work, making grants to these crowdsourcing platforms or directly to mutual aid societies. And so what I appreciated about that is that there's a value that's being put by some funders on the importance of infrastructure, because at the end of the day, right, infrastructure is about us being in right relationship to one another. And if there are more institutional funders who commit a significant portion of their portfolios into investing in infrastructure that is both flexible, nimble, and really meets the needs of the groups where they are, as opposed to asking them to meet some sort of capacity standard or threshold that might be unreachable or inaccessible to them, we're going to continue to see these amazing innovations like mutual aid societies and some of the things that Jeffrey referenced in his question.
Thank you. And should note, on the point of infrastructure funding, that's certainly one of the things that was celebrated about Mackenzie Scott's latest round of giving was an orientation towards infrastructure funding. So certainly praise where it's due there. Hilary, just a couple of questions for you from Brenda Hirschmer from Campus for Communities of the Future. The first was on the Sustainable Development Goals. Are these being considered as a potential framework for prioritizing funding locally as well as globally, whether that's in Canada or maybe in the US, as well as the Global South? And the second is a question about why is it so hard to access funding for work that crosses sectors and silos, even where there's a growing consensus that multi-sectoral collaboration between non-profits, business, and government is a priority? So a couple of funding practice questions I thought you might be well equipped to address. And then Maribel, I'll be back with a question for you in a moment.
Absolutely. Well, okay, the SDGs. We in Canada have been talking about the SDGs and how to make them more practical as a framework for us in philanthropy ever since before they were articulated. One of the largest foundations in Canada is the MasterCard Foundation, which played a role, I think, with a number of other American foundations in trying to think through how the SDGs as a framework can be operationalized essentially at the level of philanthropy. And I think the challenge with that I've seen in Canada, and I think is true in other countries, is that you need to be working hand in hand with government. And in a sense, this also relates to the second question. So how does philanthropy work with the public sector? How does government itself take the SDGs as a framework and work that down to the local level and then roll it back up again using contributions and shaping the contributions of different parts of society to get us back up to, at a country or a state level, to a contribution to the SDGs, with an alignment of our investments to the SDG targets. We have not been that successful in Canada, I will have to say. The federal government, we are a federal state, and, there are a lot of provincial priorities and views on issues that the SDGs touch, which don't align with each other necessarily. And philanthropy has not been very effective at trying to create alignment. I'd say that it's actually been more effective in the corporate sector, and that there have been more companies that have successfully created for themselves a framework for either their corporate social responsibility investments or, in fact, for their business targets in alignment with the SDGs. So to go to your second question, which I think is related, we do have some issues in trying to build more effective cross-sectoral collaboration. I think that in Canada, again, because we're a small country and we are pretty connected, we have 2 degrees of separation here, 6 degrees in the US, maybe 2 degrees in Canada. We do find ways of connecting, and there have been more collaborative initiatives between certain companies and certain philanthropies. That said, the government's regulatory framework is one that is not flexible enough to allow for this kind of multi-sectoral work. And that's a big issue for us. We have a regulatory framework that is 19th century for a 21st century world. And that means that, for example, where you see the line blurring between, say, social enterprise and charity, and where charities, social enterprises, conventional businesses might want to work together collectively, they run into, particularly charities, run into rules and regulations that make it very difficult for them to transfer funds. Part of this is very similar to the UK, because our regulations of regulation of charities based on common law understanding of what is charitable, and a lot of it comes directly from the UK. But where you have actually modernized your regulation, we have not yet. So this is a big topic of debate in Canada right now. But right now, the will is there, and I think some of the mechanisms need to be developed further.
So maybe we'll see the liberalisation of the market for philanthropy in Canada, following other countries, for good or ill. And I just want to pick up on that point about markets with Maribel. So we've got 2 questions in the chat. One from Patricia Rosenfield, who says, beyond recommendations that we've been discussing, like payout reform and diversifying boards, what structural changes, or even wealth tax, what structural changes will make real, just and lasting change, whether they're wider structural changes to society or the economy or to philanthropy itself? And related to that, I just want to bring in a question, this is probably the final one before we go to Amanda. A question from Timothy Wyman McCarthy, who said, how should progressive actors and advocates within philanthropy respond to the increasing marketization of philanthropy? Should funders who think in these market-oriented ways be encouraged to work with social movements, for example? So, would you want to resist that marketization or embrace it? And what structural changes are needed? If you could wrap your answers into 2 minutes, which I know is a tall order, that would be really appreciated. But over to you, Maribel.
Okay, so hi, Pat. I can't see you, but I know you're there. Thanks for the question. I'll do a meta response and then a micro. So at the meta, what structural changes, philanthropy by definition, and we're using the definition here of philanthropy that Andrew Carnegie subscribed to in Gospel of Wealth, right? Elite philanthropy, is really this main form, as he suggested, main form of wealth redistribution in a capitalist society. As a form of avoiding socialism. So wealth distribution right through the state. Instead of that, you keep it in the hands of the wealthy, and they are the ones who redistribute it, knowing best what the society needs. So I think at a meta level, big changes that can happen are current conversations on thinking beyond neoliberalism, thinking beyond the Cold War binary of neoliberalism versus communism. What other forms of national and international political economy can we imagine that would be sustainable and would help so many of us across the world thrive better? And that's inherently a question about the role of philanthropy as a primary form of wealth redistribution in our political economies. I would say at the micro level, and I'm going to plug my book, White Philanthropy, here. I think that grant makers can have real honest questions about, I give three. So the people that I study that were trying to make a white world order saw themselves, so these are people in philanthropy and government, and actually in religious groups, but they saw themselves as friends of Black people. These are white Anglo-Americans. So it's not so different from today. The real harm in how you might be remembered, or we all might be remembered later on in the future by our children and their children, is how our definitions of racial equality might be very different from grantees. And I'm using the perspective of a grant maker, which I'm not, but I'm putting myself in that role because I do that in the archives and we're here in this conversation. So the funders had a very different vision of racial equality, a very specific one. Their definition of racial equality assumed that subordinated people, colonized people, should be willing to wait for whatever definition of equality that the dominant group of white Anglo-Americans provided, and at whatever speed. So something that grant makers could do today that would be very meaningful would be to have a very honest conversation. What is their vision for racial equality? Does it line up with their grantees, with the general public? Which groups of the general public? There's so many, and even within the global majority, we have very different definitions of racial equality for ourselves. So having all of those very honest conversations would be important. And also relatedly, our visions for international and national peace. Many times, much like the characters that I study, and today there's an assumption that international peace and national peace requires white Anglo-American domination. So let's have an honest conversation on that. And lastly, at a very micro level too, who are grant makers' go-to network of advisors? Even within the global majority, even within, a quote unquote vision of a diverse group of advisors, why do you think, if we put ourselves in that position, the grant maker, why am I attracted to that person? What vision of on the ground work or of equality makes me attracted to that particular individual and their work? So having much more explicit discussions in a way that they're rather left implicit right now and vague will make a substantive difference.
Maribel, thank you for allowing us and encouraging us to consider some very new and different directions for philanthropy. And with that, I want to bring in Amanda for some of her reflections on what she's been hearing. Over to you, Amanda.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, hear you great.
Okay, great. I just want to ground ourselves in the incredible privilege we have to be able to have these discussions while people are suffering. And I think that when we leave these discussions, we need to realize not only the incredible privilege, but the power we have to move resources and systems to further liberation. And we can't just tinker around the edges of equity and even justice. And I think all of you have pushed us to think differently during this time. But I always question, what are we going to do now? We have very little time. We have very little time while there is a movement attacking teaching history, acknowledging history. There is a movement attacking equity and justice. And we are still thinking about theories of change and grant reports and not turning over resources in a way that really acknowledges the power that communities already have. And we as philanthropy infrastructure, leaders in philanthropy, people who get to have these privileged conversations, need to think about the rightful awakening and uprising last year that was rooted in the United States, but was a global movement where people put bodies on the line for shared liberation. So I would just say that we should leave this discussion thinking about, what are we actually putting on the line? Our jobs, our bodies, our comforts from our own homes, to move philanthropy to a place of actual liberation and reform. that we should be thinking about all that we do in the form of reparations and repair, and not just in grant making. And I hope that we have started to have these conversations in ways that actually move to bold action. So I appreciate the panelists today that gave us real examples and an intellectual push, and now it's time to act.
Well, on that note of action, we'll be trying to monitor, review, and cover what action is going to be taken by the philanthropy sector in the coming years. That's our role at Alliance. And I just want to thank you, Amanda, and everyone at the United Philanthropy Forum for your partnership today, in particular Dave Beamsdorfer and Tracy Slater-Rigo, and also for your contribution not just to the development of philanthropy infrastructure, but the development of a more just infrastructure for philanthropy in the US and worldwide. So thank you for that. I hope you've enjoyed today's discussion. If you found it helpful and engaging, don't forget to go to the offers section on the right-hand side of your screen and subscribe to Alliance, which will give you 4 issues with news, analysis, and features from across the global philanthropy sector, including our 100th ever issue that comes out in September. I can assure you that's been a labor of love to put together. I'd like to end just by thanking our expert panelists, in addition to Amanda, Marissa, Tirona, Dr. Maribel Moray, and Hilary Pearson. It's been a real pleasure to spend time with you, get to know you all, and hear your thoughts, and I'm sure that's shared by everyone listening here. Thanks also to the Alliance team, especially Anne-Marie McQueen, who produced today's event. And thanks to all of you that are listening here for being part of the growing Alliance community today. Our Future of Philanthropy webinar series continues in August, when we take a look at where philanthropy is headed across Africa. And of course, as I mentioned, don't miss that special issue of Alliance, our 100th issue, coming out in September. You can find out more about our upcoming events online at alliancemagazine.org. But thank you so much for all of you for joining us today, and looking forward to continuing the conversations. All the best and good night. Bye-bye for now.